The Middle East is on fire again, although, to be honest, the flames there never really died down. Only this time, the world's attention is not focused on events in Syria or the Gaza Strip, but on the unprecedented nationwide protests in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The situation there was so serious that at one point there were even rumors about the local dictator possibly fleeing to Moscow. And here is Lei Khamenei under the warm wing of the Orthodox Tsar. There he would have joined Assad, Yanukovych, and other fallen leaders. In today's video, we will analyze in detail the causes and characteristic features of these protests, examine the current domestic political situation in Iran, and also touch on the specifics of the general public mood. And we'll also try to predict whether Trump will eventually deliver a crushing blow to Iran. My name is Semyon. The Megashot television channel brings you only verified facts and balanced analysis of events. Let's begin. People take to the streets first and foremost. I want to emphasize that on our channel, we periodically address the extremely complex problem of the Middle East and the prospects for its resolution. In the latest video, we touched upon major geopolitical shifts that, although often subtle and not always noticeable to an outside observer, are nevertheless changing the face of the region. I recommend watching it for a better understanding of the current situation, but the surprise came from another direction, where no one really expected it. From within, the main troublemaker and instigator has practically been identified. In any case, for the past several decades, Iran has acted this way. Until recently, it operated covertly through its proxy forces, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Yemeni Houthis. And here, as often happens, protests started when people took to the streets with empty stomachs. That's how it was in France on the eve of the storming of the Bastille, and that's how it was in snowy Petrograd back in 1917. And that's how it will be outside the Kremlin walls if Putin runs out of money to maintain even some semblance of war or normal life. However, today we're talking about Iran, which, as you understand, has a number of specific features. To begin with, just a couple of words about this uniquely distinctive dictatorship. It is a theocracy, meaning that supreme power is concentrated in the hands of religious leaders. The fact is that after the 1979 revolution, power in Iran was seized by the highest Muslim clergy led by Ayatollah, who is something like the Islamic equivalent of the Pope or the Orthodox Patriarch. And then, new rules started to be introduced, which were considered extreme even for Muslim countries. Public hand amputation for theft, stoning for adultery, hanging for homosexuality, mandatory hijab for women. It's pure medieval times, but that's what the rules of Sharia law dictate. And since then, not much has changed, at least not for the better. Formally, outwardly, Iran looks like an ordinary authoritarian state, typical for Asia and third world countries in general. But there is a president of Iran, as many as 5 vice presidents who assist him, there is a government, ministers, and a parliament called the Majlis, whose actual powers, however, are not much greater than those of the Russian State Duma. However, all of this is nothing more than a facade. All real power is concentrated in the hands of the supreme leader of Iran, or Rabar. This position has been held by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei since 1989. He is an extremely suspicious and conservative old man who will soon turn 87, living more in the world of the Quran and Islamic dogmas than in the realities of the modern world. However, what you can't take away from him is his desire to cling to power with all his hands, feet, and any other organs Allah has given him. And he'll do so until his dying day. An empty stomach is the engine of revolution, and so the people rose up against this medieval regime, Ayatollah. However, as I mentioned earlier, it all started with economic problems, quite ordinary and pressing. On December 28, 2025, the merchants of Tehran's central city market took to the streets to protest against the sharp drop in the national currency, which had almost halved during December, from 817,500 reals per dollar to 1.5 million rials. According to local media, the most active participants in the protests were sellers of mobile phones, electronics, and household appliances, who buy their goods in foreign currency but sell them in the local currency. They explained their actions by saying, "We can't buy goods in the morning and sell them in the evening. The exchange rate changes within hours." So initially, the protesters put forward rather modest demands to return the exchange rate at least to the levels that were in early December, and also to bring the official exchange rate in banks in line with the real rate on the black market. You see, in such a closed country like Iran, the black market surpasses the legal one in terms of volume. Many goods, for example alcohol, can only be obtained under the counter. So, at first, the protests were very limited, so the authorities initially underestimated the scale of the threat. Moreover, President Masoud Pezeshkian even stated that the people really do have reasons to be dissatisfied and called on law enforcement to show restraint. On the same day, the head of the Iranian Central Bank announced his resignation. In addition, the authorities announced currency interventions to stabilize the exchange rate. However, all these measures had extremely limited results. The real exchange rate strengthened by less than 10% to about 1.3 million reals per dollar. Naturally, the protests continued, and at the same time, they spread beyond the capital to major cities such as Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad. The list of protesters' demands was also expanding. In the first days of the new year 2026, the protests became sharply more radical. And this was because the most progressive part of society, those ready to take risks, took to the streets. Of course, it was the youth, and first and foremost the students of the most prestigious university, Amir Kabir University of Technology. For many years, this institution has had a reputation as a center of liberal ideas and officially banned Western values, not only among students but also among professors. Moreover, such a technically advanced audience has access to opportunities to bypass existing internet censorship that are not available to everyone. This deserves a more detailed discussion. I think you understand as well as I do that any dictatorship, including religious ones, when establishing its censorship, first targets the internet. That's why Iran created its own firewall, not as powerful as China's, but still more systematic and well-designed than Russia's. Of course, all popular Western services like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Wikipedia, and Google are completely blocked. Moreover, in recent years, work has been underway on the so-called National Information Network. In other words, the authorities want to fulfill the long-standing dream of every modern dictator to create their own sovereign internet and completely cut ordinary Iranians off from the world and from each other. But even under such difficult conditions, Iranians do not lose heart and keep looking for new ways to bypass the restrictions. Various proxy servers, VPNs, and the Tor browser are just a few of the resources being used. Especially, as already mentioned, technically savvy youth in Iran have excelled at this. Despite the obvious poverty and apparent backwardness of the country, there is a large core of highly qualified engineering professionals. Since the Ayatollah regime constantly declares the need to export the Islamic Revolution to other countries and secretly develops nuclear weapons, huge resources are invested specifically in defense. This is at the expense of other industries. Like during the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, it's better to go without pants than tanks. But there's another side to this coin. The regime needs its own engineers, a lot of engineers for the needs of the constantly growing military-industrial complex. Being an engineer in Iran is very prestigious, especially an information technology engineer. And, as you might guess, the more educated and technically savvy a person is, the more inevitably he starts to think critically and doubt the truthfulness of official propaganda. And at the same time, he gets the opportunity to at least slightly lift the Iron Curtain and see what's happening in the decaying West. As a result, almost every other Iranian is on Telegram. A smaller number use WhatsApp, and some even manage to get access to the Holy of Holies, Instagram and YouTube. Moreover, even though the average resident of such an Islamic republic lives in poverty, a smartphone has long ceased to be a luxury item and has become commonplace, especially in cities. Especially if it's a cheap Chinese-made device. In the last 5 to 7 years, the number of Iranians actively using the internet has at least doubled, and according to various estimates, their share is already 75 to 80%. In major metropolises like Tehran, Mashhad, and Isfahan, 4G is operating successfully, and as a result, mobile networks and internet services are well developed. Even by Western standards, online shopping, ordering taxis through apps, and internet banking have become commonplace. Even in cities, people tend to get their news not from propaganda media, but from Telegram channels. That's why almost every citizen has a smartphone, even women, despite numerous bans and restrictions. As you can see, Iran is slowly but surely becoming digitalized, and this very digitalization could become the nail in the coffin of such a hated regime. And this is a cumulative republic cumulative effect. There's an old well-known joke from the Brezhnev era. What's the difference between a Komsomol member from the 1930s and one from the 1970s? The first one can handle anything, the second one doesn't care about anything. Is that how you understood me? For what purpose? I made that comparison to highlight the indifferent attitude of young people toward the authorities, society, and current events, both the Soviet and the Iranian. As young people become more educated in Rostov and as the ruling regime itself decays, they grow increasingly indifferent to the official agenda and more oppositional in their attitudes. Despite the early closed-off nature, it is still obvious even to the naked eye that a significant part of modern urban youth is striving in every possible way for a more secular lifestyle. They ignore or only formally observe official religious dogmas and drink a little alcohol despite the strict prohibitions of Prophet Muhammad. Almost all experts claim that violating official prohibitions, such as dress codes and behavior, has become a noticeable social practice among city dwellers born after 2000, that is, among the so-called millennials. Moreover, demographics are not in favor of the regime, since due to a very high birth rate, about 60% of Iran's population is under 30 years old. This is not the ever-aging Europe, where most people love comfort, prosperity, and stability, and that's why I suggest you subscribe to Direction. Find out everything that's happening in the sky and the sea. We're starting to wrap up the video to sharpening, and sorry about that. Iranians are not very susceptible to official propaganda and traditional religious views compared to the older generations. Moreover, among young people, it has become popular to convert to another religion, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, or even Judaism. Although it is risky, it happens. However, members of religious minorities are allowed some concessions. For example, members of Christian communities are permitted to produce wine for religious ceremonies, such as communion, and to consume it within their own homes. For example, the hijab requirement also applies to non-Muslim and foreign women. In public places, however, everyone without exception must follow Islamic norms, so it makes sense. In recent years, more and more Iranians have been actively engaging with global culture. Audio and video productions, musical subcultures such as rap and rock, dancing, creative self-expression, meeting with friends, cafes, culture. Despite official restrictions and moral prescriptions, many young women in cities almost openly ignore the strict requirements for wearing the hijab and for clothing in general. In short, on an everyday level, traditional restrictions are increasingly observed selectively or symbolically. Simply put, many Iranians lead a double life. They follow the formal rules in public, but completely ignore them at home. An important factor contributing to the growth of protest sentiments is the already mentioned economic problems, which are increasingly taking on the character of a systemic and deep crisis, or, at the very least, economic stagnation. It's no secret that Iran has been under sanctions for many decades because of its extremely aggressive policies, especially its pursuit of developing its own nuclear weapons. Obtaining advanced technologies, especially military ones, is very difficult. That's why almost all the foreign currency revenue from oil exports, and by the way the main buyer is China, is spent by the Iranian authorities on preparations for war. Accordingly, ordinary people get nothing but scraps. And while in the early 2000s oil prices were consistently high, in recent years there has been a trend of slow but steady decline in global prices for oil and petroleum products, which really hits the wallets of dictators not only in Iran but also in other countries. One is sitting in Moscow, another was recently in Caracas, and now he's in a New York prison cell. It is precisely in energy prices that the economic power and at the same time the downfall of the ruling regimes in countries like Iran, Venezuela, and of course the Russian Federation lie. So the economic situation in Iran inevitably pushes the most active part of the population toward protests. As they say, sooner or later, the refrigerator will win over the television. Especially since, by the end of 2025, the inflation rate was one of the highest in the world. In the ranking where falling behind would actually be a good thing, Iran takes an honorable 5th place, and the 1st place, as you might have guessed, goes to the world leader in oil reserves, Venezuela. It's a complete economic bottom there. And in the end, the political factor played a role, more precisely, the military political factor. Last year, Iran experienced its first real war on its own territory in almost 30 years, a 12-day war with Israel. Yes, of course, it wasn't as intense as in Ukraine, since there was no ground component at all due to the lack of a shared border, and there was no real front line as such. Plus, As you can tell from the name, the fighting was very brief, from June 13 to June 24, but still, about 1,000 Iranians were killed. And that's even though Israel was trying to strike not at civilians, but at military and nuclear infrastructure. These aren't Russian high-precision missiles that turn residential buildings into piles of smoldering ruins in Moscow. Those are real barbarians. Of course, the Iranian authorities tried to make the most of the war for their own benefit, effectively using the patriotic feelings of ordinary citizens. And that's not surprising at all, because it's one thing to dislike the authorities in peacetime, and quite another when deadly missiles and drones are flying over your head. The emergence of a sense of unity in the face of the enemy in such circumstances is simply inevitable, especially since Israel, despite all its bombings, has not achieved its strategic goal of overthrowing the theocratic dictatorship. And Ayatollah Khamenei remained in power and even allowed himself to declare victory over the Zionists and the United States of America. However, this kind of nationwide unity did not last long, because the military events, accompanied by the destruction of infrastructure, objectively worsened the already existing economic crisis. The devaluation of money, low wages, especially on the black market, shortages of consumer goods, and the lack of any real prospects are simply impossible to cover up with ultra-patriotic slogans. And the notorious slogan, "There's no money, but you hang in there," will never have a long-term effect. We know this all too well. Change, we want change. And once again, I want to recall an example from the half-forgotten Soviet past, when back in 1988, Sergei Solovyov's film ASSA was released on the big screen. It almost immediately became a kind of cultural bomb, and even a phenomenon of its time. But what viewers remembered most was the final song performed by the unforgettable Viktor Tsoi. Our hearts demand change. Our eyes demand change. Almost every second resident of Essa was humming this to themselves back then. This song became not just a hit, but at the same time an anthem and a symbol of Gorbachev's perestroika. And now the Iranians have taken to the streets with practically the same slogan, "Change, we want change." Economic demands quickly turned into political ones, and the protesters began to demand not cosmetic, but deep changes. Down with the Ayatollah, death to the dictator, death to Khamenei, down with the Islamic Republic. This is what the protesters were shouting in early January, and the protests were spreading like mushrooms after the rain. In general, protests in Iran are quite common. They traditionally occur almost regularly every 3-4 years, in 2009, 2017, 2018, 2019, and in 2022. The most recent ones stand out because they targeted police brutality and defended human rights. The reason was the arrest of 22-year-old Amini by officers of the so-called Morality Patrol for improper wearing of a hijab. In prison, she was beaten to death, which triggered mass protests that were suppressed by the authorities with considerable effort. But all these previous acts of civil disobedience are nothing compared to the modern ones. This time, the protests spread not only to Tehran and major cities, but to all 31 provinces of Iran. According to preliminary estimates, up to 1.5 million people took to the streets of the capital, and up to 5 million across the country, with a total population of 65 million. In percentage terms, that's even more than 12 years ago, when Ukrainians came out during the Euromaidan. It should be said that those who opposed were not just calling for the overthrow of the current regime, but also offered a quite reasonable alternative. Strangely enough, they were demanding the restoration of the monarchy, even though revolutionaries usually advocate for a republic, but in this case, everything was turned completely upside down. Iranians want the return of the Shah, the son of the last Shah, who was overthrown by Ayatollah Khamenei in 1979. He now lives in the United States and leads the National Council of Iran. That is, the government in exile dreams of returning to their homeland and reclaiming the father's throne. Therefore, in addition to calls for "down with the Ayatollah," more and more often you hear calls like "long live the Shah," "long live Pahlavi," "this is the final battle, Pahlavi will return." And also, neither Gaza nor Lebanon lives are given only for Iran, which means the need to abandon the aggressive policy of the theocratic regime. At the same time, Reza Pahlavi himself, although he is abroad, is not just an outside observer, but acts as a coordination center. He speaks out on social media almost every day in support of the protesters. The dictatorship is holding on, but in short, in just a few days, the situation in Iran has become so unstable and unpredictable that it turned out the end of the rotten regime is already near. That's why, as early as January 4, the British Times, citing military intelligence, 6 Intelligence wrote that Ayatollah Khamenei, along with his 20 closest associates, was preparing to flee to Moscow. And he even sent bags of cash there for a rainy day. And a couple of days later, the rebels captured the cities of Abdanan and Malik Shahi, located in the Kurdish region of Iran. But the Kurds have traditionally been connected with Israel, which opens the door for possible external intervention, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Nevertheless, the Islamist fanatics are in no hurry to surrender yet. Khamenei, as expected, refused to make any concessions and blames the United States and Israel for inciting the protests. The Iranian General Staff has already threatened several times to strike Tel Aviv again, so the protests began to be suppressed with a brutality unprecedented even by Iranian standards. They used heavy machine guns mounted on APCs and other armored vehicles, as well as helicopters, something that had never been done before. As a result, the number of victims is unprecedented. Within less than a month, between 20,000 and 40,000 peaceful Iranians have been killed. Witnesses describe the situation as a real genocide, since the security forces open fire to kill anyone they see, even if those people had nothing to do with anything. Mass executions are happening in the streets without any investigation or trial. The authorities admit that the number of dead is only 3,000, but no one believes these figures. But most importantly, it's to stop the coordination of protesters' actions in Telegram channels, and also to make sure the world knows less about the atrocities taking place. On January 8, the internet and mobile communications were completely shut down throughout Iran. They simply flipped the switch across the entire country, turning smartphones and other gadgets into beautiful but useless boxes. A total information blackout is unthinkable in the 21st century. It's brutal, and Putin definitely has something to learn from this. Will Trump strike? So, what is known at this point is that the internet in Iran still hasn't been turned back on, so information is coming in with big delays, sometimes even 3 to 4 days later. The only way to communicate with the outside world is through Starlink. Iranians have a few thousand terminals that were previously smuggled in. In response, the regime's servants are using powerful radio jammers to block the satellite signal. That's why the owners have to constantly change their location. As for restoring normal internet access, there are rumors that this time the authorities have decided to completely and irreversibly cut the country off from the World Wide Web and implement their own fully controlled national version of the internet. Now, regarding the protests, the authorities claim to have restored control around January 16th or 17th. However, it was obvious even to the naked eye that this was a lie. It's hard to say what the situation is like now, but one thing is certain: the protest potential hasn't gone anywhere, and full control is still a long way off. At least one piece of evidence is that this happened not without the help of American or Israeli hackers. On January 19, Reza Pahlavi was able to address the people of Iran through state satellite and television, calling on the military to stop shooting at their fellow citizens and to side with the protesters. In any case, the future of the protests and the future of the Islamic dictatorship are now in the hands of external players. The interest of Israel and the United States in the fall of the Ayatollah regime is obvious, but whether they will directly intervene to support the Iranian people, especially America, is the real question. Almost from the very first days of the protests, Donald Trump spoke out in support of the demonstrators, stating that if Iran shoots and brutally kills peaceful protesters, which is their usual practice, the United States will come to their aid. We are ready to take action and are at full combat readiness. On January 13, the United States imposed a 25% tariff against Iran's trading partners, thereby trying to weaken the connection with the main economic support of the Ayatollah regime, China. In the 20s of January, additional units of American forces led by the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln were deployed from East and Southeast Asia to the Persian Gulf region. The concentration of American troops at the largest military base in the Middle East, Al Udeid, which is in Qatar, indicates that something serious is being planned. According to many analysts, the United States is technically ready to launch a powerful missile or combined missile and drone strike against Iran in the coming weeks, either together with Israel or without it. Now, the final word belongs to the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. Will he dare to take this historic step? On one hand, Donald Trump is as afraid of getting the United States involved in full-scale military conflicts as the devil is of holy water, since such conflicts would inevitably lead to mass casualties among American soldiers. That's why he prefers to act quickly and precisely, in the spirit of classic special operations. The abduction of Venezuelan President Maduro is a vivid example of this. On the other hand, without direct military intervention, sanctions alone definitely won't bring down the Ayatollah's regime. And if Khamenei and those like him continue to rule, if not today, then in a decade, it will lead to the emergence of a new nuclear state on the world map. It's hard to even imagine a worse scenario for Israel or for the whole world. In any case, let's wish good luck to our beloved people of Iran. And they truly deserve peace, stability, and democracy. We continue to follow the events in the Middle East. They definitely won't let us get bored. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all the sponsors for supporting the channel during this difficult time. See you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.